Hey, folks, welcome in to the newest edition of Pilcher's Perspective. It's been a little while since we've talked to you. We're in a brand new studio, new place. It's called My Basement. And this is where we're going to be taking you through our next few journeys here. Of course, I try to look at current events and put them in a more historical perspective to maybe give you an idea of how things really are or should be viewed at, because I think it's a perspective you just don't hear a lot of. And this one, I'll grant it, is a topic that could be considered a little bit dated by some people, but since I finally was able to get going, I feel there's some stuff that needs to be heard about it. And we're going to think of the Tom Brady and the GOAT status thing. And it's really a conversation that I think is overdone a lot, but I rarely ever hear about it in the context that I feel it should be brought up. Okay. Now, after Brady's team, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, won the Super Bowl, there was more talk. Brady's the greatest of all time. And some have even said might even be the greatest athlete of all time. Now, comparing athletes from team sports to those of individual sports is extremely difficult. I haven't really thought of a good way to do it, and I really don't care enough to figure it out either. But, this whole GOAT of GOAT argument, normally heard from those in the media in many places, is that since Tom Brady's won his 7 Super Bowl titles, more than any other player in NFL history, now has done it with 2 separate franchises, he has to be the greatest ever, right? No, not necessarily. Now, all that means to me is he's the greatest winner in the NFL. And it's not just him, by the way, because Otto Graham, who was the quarterback of the Browns in the 40s and 50s, played 10 seasons, played in the title game all 10 years, and won 7 championships. Now, there's a bit of a caveat with Graham's career, granted, in that the first 4 titles came when the Browns were a member of the All-American Football Conference, not the NFL, from 1946 through 1949. They won the title all 4 years. They, along with the 49ers and the Colts, joined the NFL for the 1950 season. The Browns played the defending champion Philadelphia Eagles in an opening night game and beat the tar out of them, wound up beating the Rams for the title. So they won it anyway. And the NFL, in their official records, does recognize the All-American Football Conference as an official league and does count that as an official championship in NFL records. So if you look it up, Cleveland actually has won 8 NFL championships. 4 of those came, granted, when they had officially joined the NFL after 1950, and Graham was part of 3 of those teams, but they're all counted. And he played in the conference title game all 10 years. And this is one of the issues I've had for a while with the NFL, is that it doesn't do a good job of discussing its history prior to the Super Bowl, which would be the 1966 season onward. For some reason, because of the brand of the Super Bowl and the big event, really national holiday that it really is, it doesn't really seem to care about it. And the only difference for the most part is that instead of calling it NFL championship game, they renamed it the Super Bowl. And I know it was AFL against NFL, but essentially that's the only difference. So the only reason I think it's not thought of that way is because those games prior to 66 weren't called the Super Bowl, even though they meant the exact same thing. And I'm sure players will tell you playing in that game probably had the same feel as playing at a Super Bowl. So I wanted to get that out of the way because I've heard very few people bring up the fact that, Tom Brady is the only one who's won 7 titles as a quarterback. And by the way, it's a team sport, and I'll get into that. But Otto Graham did as well. I just felt that needed to be said. I'm not really going to dive into who the greatest quarterback is, because that would take a long time. So I'm just going to compare 2 people, Joe Montana and Tom Brady. They're normally the 2 brought up. And to me, I still say Joe Montana was the greatest quarterback of all time. I don't think it's a definitive statement. I think it's very much an opinion, but I want to give it its due because I haven't brought it up this way. And I'm sure there's a lot of other ways you can determine, who the great player is, but you have to take the eras in which they played into deep consideration when you're looking at anything. The raw numbers don't do justice. For example, Montana's rookie year was 1981. Or I should say his rookie year was 79, but his first year as a full-time starter was in 81. The NFL's average quarterback rating as a league that year was 72.9. This past season in 2020, the average NFL quarterback rating was 93.6, passing significantly easier today than it was throughout most all of Joe Montana's career and really at any other time. And there's a lot that has changed in the 25, 26, 27 years since Montana played, specifically all the NFL rule changes that we have seen that protect quarterbacks and wide receivers so much. These numbers, of course, help inflate passing statistics. You've gone from tight end and formations and power formations into these spreads, which help bring up the one-on-one situations where you isolate your best guys, you get the splits wide. It's a lot harder to cover those guys. You're basically not allowed to touch a quarterback or breathe on one, or it's a 15-yard penalty. And the pre-snap reads for the quarterback are kind of easier. It's like, all right, where's the best one-on-one matchup? That's where I'm going to go. Now, I think teams do a pretty good job of disguising coverages a lot now as compared to Montana's days. But the physicality and the way you played defense during Montana's time was significantly tougher to get around right now. And modern quarterbacks also have the advantage of having more film to study and much more detailed scouting reports than at any other time in history, too. So you have to take all of that into consideration when you're looking at players of really any decade. And I think kids even grow up now, playing in your backyard, playing in these 7-on-7 tournaments. And that's almost the way football has become in a way. But the evolution of the passing rules has done a lot with the way football is played now. In 1989, Joe Montana's quarterback rating, that was probably his finest year with a team that could have been the greatest team of all time. His rating that year was 112.4. 112.4 in 1989. The average quarterback rating in the league that year, 75.6. All right. So he was, I don't know what percentile that is better because I'm bad at math, but he was way, way higher than what the average league quarterback was. In 2007, when the Patriots went unbeaten until they lost to the Giants in the Super Bowl, Brady had an incredible rating of 117.2. But if you put that in perspective, the average NFL passer rating that season, I don't have the actual number here, but it was about 45% better than what the average rating was, which is still really, really good, but not as great as the difference between Montana's rating and the average league rating during his career. And in Montana's career, there were roughly, and this is basically a 15-year career, there were 9 times when he posted a passer rating that was at least 20% higher than the league average. Brady had done that roughly 5 or 6 times in his career. So Montana was, in most any statistical category you want to look at, significantly above his peers and, what the rest of the league was as compared to Tom Brady. I'm not trying to knock Brady here. I'm just bringing up ways to look at things that I don't think are talked about enough. And many people do put the research into this. Montana, when he really put the numbers in perspective, had better numbers than Brady did throughout his career in most any way you really want to look at things. Now, if you want to look at the playoff numbers, and, you're always defined, they say, by Super Bowls. I mean, I don't know if I agree with that either, because again, it's a team sport. But if you really want to bring up the postseason factor, I've got the numbers jotted down here. They're close to identical in the postseason. Brady, in 45 career games, has completed 62.7% of his passes. That's the same number Montana completed in 23 career games. And again, they completed significantly fewer passes on a percentage in Montana's career than they did in Brady's. Montana averages about 251 yards a game, Brady about 276. They both have better than 2-to-1 touchdown interception ratios. Montana's is 45-21. Brady's is 83-38. Montana averaged 7.9 yards per attempt in his career in the postseason. Brady's at 7.1. And quarterback rating, I'm not a huge fan of that stat, I'll be honest, even though I've talked about it a lot, but it's one of the ways people use to grade quarterbacks. In the postseason, Brady's at 90.4. That's actually 15th all time. Montana's at 95.6. Touchdown percentage, Brady's 4.7, Montana 6.1. INT percentage, Brady 2.2, Montana 2.9. They threw way more interceptions during Montana's time than they do Brady's. They also throw more touchdown passes than in Brady's time when you look at that of Montana. During Montana's average career, the average NFL quarterback completed 56% of his passes. Montana completed 63%. Brady, during his career, the average quarterback completed 61%. Brady completes 64%. Montana was way ahead of his peers in that regard. In terms of percentage of passing yards per season, they're about the same. Touchdown interception ratio in the regular season, again, their numbers are about the same. But in terms of the percentages above, Montana still much better than his peers than was Mr. Tom Brady. And Montana was a guy that was just ahead of his time. A lot of that was because of the somewhat modernish offense they ran under Bill Walsh with the West Coast offense. That had a lot to do with it. And yes, he had Freddie Solomon and Dwight Clark and then Jerry Rice and all that. But you are largely in every team sport somewhat a product of the team around you. That's not a mistake. And yeah, Montana had great guys around him. Brady, I think you could argue, has done a lot without overwhelming talent at times. Certainly those teams in 07, 08 with Moss and Welker and all that were incredible. But remember, their first three Super Bowls, 01, 03, 04, they won with defense and running the ball. Offensively, they were primarily middle of the pack, certainly in 01 and 03. When they got Corey Dillon in 04, their numbers went up. But they were middle of the pack offensively most of those years. They won with defense. And it wasn't until about 07 or so, really 06, that they started to go up the offensive route. And that's when offense really started to explode around the NFL. And a lot of those rule changes came to be. And of course, it was Brady's season-ending injury at the beginning of the 08 season that really changed the way that teams officiate what happens in the NFL. Because in 2008, that's when the NFL changed the rules, outlawing defensive players from touching quarterbacks below the knee or above the neck. Also in 04, they started to emphasize the 5-yard bump rule much more than they had before. The NFL wants more scoring because most fans want more scoring. Most leagues try to do that. And that has coincided. I mean, look at Ryan Fitzpatrick's career numbers. You might laugh at me for saying that. You'd be shocked how good his career numbers are. It's a lot easier playing quarterback now than it was during Montana's time. And I think when you look at the percentage of how much better Montana was amongst his peers than the percentage better than Tom Brady has been, you'll find that really Montana has him beat virtually across the board. The one thing that has helped Brady has been his longevity. He's at the age of 43. It's incredible the lack of arm strength he seems to have lost. And that's says something. It's not easy to play at that high level for that long, and the dedication you need to do that. But the fact that Tom Brady just hasn't taken a lot of hits in his career and has had incredible offensive line play and gets rid of the ball so fast, and partially that's him, has helped him do that. Montana played in a time where you didn't have that kind of protection, and chances are, if Brady would have played during Montana's career, he would not be playing right now at the age of 30, or excuse me, at the age of 43. His career would likely be over because he would have taken too many hits. The famous hit Joe took in the 1990 NFC title game. He missed most of 91, then went to Kansas City. Almost did what Brady did, leading them to a Super Bowl appearance, lost the AFC title game to Buffalo. Almost really did the same thing. And they just weren't a good enough team to beat Buffalo that year. But it's really similar stories at a similar situation. I'm not saying absolutely Montana was the greatest ever, because there's a lot of numbers. And I think if you break it down, we'll tell you Steve Young might actually be the best quarterback of all time. But the fact that in a team sport, you count championships as the only thing that counts, to me, has always been utterly absurd. And it's how much better were you than the other players during your era that really dictates to me, and to a lot of people, historians and what have you, that I also talk to. That's what we look at when we're discussing who the best ever is. If you want to look at Babe Ruth's OPS and OPS plus was something like 201. He was about 200% better than league average throughout his career, let alone his best seasons. And there's some caveats when Ruth played, the lack of Negro League players that were allowed to play then. And there's some caveats to that, but that's still an absurd number to put up. And that's why I think a lot of times in baseball, it's easier to define the best players, because a lot of those statistics exist already that take all that into consideration. That's harder to find in football, but now we have adjusted passer rating and all this other stuff that if you read seems to hold up. And I think in terms of adjusted passer rating all time, I think Tom Brady is sixth, which is still ridiculous. And I think Montana's third. I think Steve Young's actually number one there, but it's just something to bring up. And that's also why when they're talking about all this goat of goat stuff, it's just a lazy way to look at it. Who won the most championships? It's just a lazy way to do it. And an easy way you can just kind of throw trash at the wall and get people talking and get people fired up. That's what they try to do primarily. And that's what they do with that discussion. There's not a lot of backbone to it. And if you really want goat of goats roots in there, and I'm not talking about the Michael Phelps, Serena Williams, Simone Biles, I'm not talking about those individuals because, again, those are independent sports. But look at what Wayne Gretzky did throughout his career. To me, Wayne Gretzky is the goat of goats, and it's really not close. And I think part of the reason he doesn't get brought up as much is he's not a me guy. He's not in the media too much. He's not a look at me guy. And he played in the NHL. And hockey, though it's a little more niche in the United States, it is one of the four major sports, but it's not what the other three are. And when Gretzky won his 4 Stanley Cups, that was in the mid 80s. And I think that enough time has passed since then now that maybe it's forgotten about. The only thing you need to know about Wayne Gretzky, okay, the only thing you need to know if you're talking about a greatest ever situation is that if you took away his 894 lifetime goals, his 1,963 assists alone would still give him the most points scored in NHL history. That's all you need to know about Wayne Gretzky. He has lapped the field of everyone who has ever played. I know those Edmonton teams are loaded. He was on a line with Yari Curry and Mark Messier, and they were absurd. That doesn't happen alone. Only 11 players have gotten more than 1,000 assists in the NHL's entire about 100-year history, okay? Wayne Gretzky would lead based on his assist total alone as the all-time point scorer. That is what it is. That is beyond words. He had 44% more points than Mark Messier, okay? To put that in perspective, that means somebody would have had to hit 335 more career home runs than Barry Bonds' 762 to be the all-time home run leader. It means somebody would have had to score nearly 17,000 points more than Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's 38,000 plus to be in Gretzky's realm. Brett Favre threw for 71,800 yards, the all-time leader in the NFL. If you had a Gretzky there, he would have thrown for more than 31,000 yards more than Favre's 71,000. What Gretzky did during his career cannot be put into words. And I could probably do a whole different thing comparing Gretzky to Ruth, to Mays or Aaron, to Montana, or the way Lawrence Taylor changed the game with his play, or Otto Graham, or, you want to pick the name Bronco Nagurski. It's going to be tough to ever find somebody in a team sport that did more than the great one did. And he has got to be the greatest athlete in a team sport of all time, or the great of the greats. I guess that doesn't technically mean you're the greatest athlete, but you were the great of the greats among what they did. So yeah, Brady's great. Is he the greatest quarterback ever? He might be. I still think when you take all the numbers and the eras into consideration, all the numbers point to me that Joe Montana was better than Tom Brady. Tom Brady's a great quarterback, but when you really dive into the numbers, he's just another great one. Up there was Staubach and some of the others. That's not a bad thing. That's not a knock against the guy. What he's done is incredible. But when you look at the percentages above, when at least compared to Joe Montana, it's really not close. And if I wanted to dive in it more, maybe I'll somehow take the time to go through those numbers and see if I can figure out who the best is. But at least of comparing to Montana to Mr. Brady, I don't think really it's all that close. So that's what we're sitting at. Now we're going to try to do this as often as possible. We'll take some of the current events going on in sports and tie it into things currently going on now, and just to give you a more historical perspective of everything that's happened. A lot of times it's stuff I don't hear in the mainstream media, and I feel like I've got to bring that to your attention in order to get that voice out there, because it's to me, the way it truly should be determined, and I just don't hear these points brought up enough. I am Mike Pilch. Hope you enjoyed it.